Hi, this is Harold. I'm recording the Monopoly and Oligopoly lecture. And please be nice to Sonny. He's going to start off the class, and then I'm going to come in and be the anchor leg. I should say I've got material in this lecture from the Krugman and Wells text and also from the Betsy Stevenson and Justin Wolfer's text, which is quite good as well. Now, economists have really developed four different models of market structure to understand how competition sort of works in the real world. Because, the standard supply and demand diagrams really assume that individual buyers and sellers are price takers, and that's really never fully realistic. And it's sometimes way off. To sort of say that Facebook or Apple are price takers is just no. So the perfect competition provides a great kind of baseline model, but is often not fully accurate. And there's monopoly and monopsony, when you have sort of one dominant buyer, one dominant seller. Ironically, if you have lots and lots of price takers, that's an easy thing to understand. The math turns out to be very simple, and the intuition is very simple. And if you have one dominant buyer or seller, that turns out to be really simple to understand. When you have a small number of players who strategically interact, that's actually the most complicated and in a lot of ways the most interesting. So, oligopoly, oligopsony, if you think about, a small number of major auto manufacturers in the United States, during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, or oligopsony when there's a small number of buyers. This one's a little bit harder to come up with good examples. I'll give you one that I think is a really good one. There's a few hospitals in a city, and they all hire nurses. Or there's Harvard and MIT competing for faculty in Cambridge, Massachusetts, U of C, Northwestern. Well, they have a common interest in keeping the wages, in the case of the hospitals, keeping the nurses' wages low, or in the cases of the faculty, not bidding up the price of faculty. And there's been informal arrangements between nearby elite institutions that they don't poach each other's faculty very much. They will cheat on that, but in general, Northwestern doesn't too often recruit faculty away from U of C and vice versa. And Harvard and MIT have sort of worked out things where they don't generally recruit each other's stars all that often. And clearly both institutions benefit at the expense of the nurses and the faculty. And then there's monopolistic competition. That's sort of an interesting one, where there's lots of little local monopolies, even though there's no real barriers to entry and exit. To me, one of the great examples of monopolistic competition is just like Walgreens and CVS. That just, if you have a local pharmacy, you have an advantage. People will come and shop near you. Or Jewel Osco, competing with another supermarket chain, where you can open up stuff anywhere, but in your local little spot, you have a little bit of market power, and that's sometimes called monopolistic competition. Differentiated products, in this case, differentiated by location. Okay? So here's sort of the standard, the standard deal. Let me just move my my Zoom toolbar out of the way because it's in an annoying spot. So this is the standard thing where you've got price taking supply side and price taking demand side, and we play this thing out. We find the equilibrium price, consumer and producer surplus, all the rest of that stuff. Okay? Everybody's being a price taker in this. Okay? Market price is whatever it is. Suppliers are willing to supply whatever they're willing to supply. Demanders are going to demand whatever they demand. Okay? There are examples, though, where we have to think about market power on both sides of the equation. And obviously, supply side market power is the one that tends to be the most important, although it's certainly not the only one. So you can charge higher prices without losing too many sales to competing businesses. So the demand curve that you face as a supplier is pretty price inelastic. That's kind of the definition of market power. But if you have no market power, you're just a little small, tiny store in a big city, the demand curve that you face for your product kind of looks like that. But I think now that could be like you're an internet vendor and you're selling, a commodity product on the internet. People can just go anywhere and buy that product. You really don't have very much market power. A firm that does have market power faces a downward sloping demand curve. So, I can charge a really high price, and then I'm going to definitely sell to the people over here who are the absolute highest demanders for my product, but a lot of other people won't buy it. Or I could lower the price to sell to more people, but then these people will pay a lower price, and I might, if I have to charge the same price to everybody, that might not be profit maximizing. Now, one of the things we'll get to later in the lecture is, what if I could charge these people more money than I charge these people? That would be fun. That's called price discrimination. Okay. So here's monopoly. So if you raise your price, you will not lose your customers to competitors, but you will lose customers to other products, or they just won't buy your stuff. Okay? So for the monopolist, the market demand curve is the same as the firm's demand curve. Okay? Monopolists have competitors. Sort of an interesting question. Do monopolists have competitors? Well, yes and no. Depends on the definition of the market. There could be one major zipper manufacturer, has no competition, nobody else makes zippers. But, if you charged a huge amount for zippers, someone could, the people who make button flies and other things. This, by the way, obviously did not write this, since I've never heard of YKK and do not really know what a button fly is on a pair of pants, although I can presumably guess. Okay. So here's De Beers diamonds. Hey, I'm just making a recording. My family's, I think, enjoying me, listening to me make my lecture. Now, this is an important slide, and it applies to for-profit and also to non-profit market structures, and you might come up with some interesting examples of each kind. But there's sort of two axes here. One is how many producers are there, and the second is how are products differentiated, if at all. Okay. So you have one producer who produces a single product. That's kind of the standard monopoly. You can also have one producer who produces different kinds of products. And I can produce Microsoft Office, and I can produce Microsoft Office Student Edition, right? Those are slightly different. I might have a monopoly over, a particular airline route, but I have first class and I have basic economy and so on. So sometimes monopolists do have fancier versions of their products, and then I could have a few producers, and that's where oligopoly and game theory come in. Okay? We've had some examples in the problem sets, the Dunkin' Donuts, Starbucks one being the most obvious example, but there's certainly other ones. Then there's many producers producing a very uniform product. That's really the perfect competition paradigm, or many producers producing differentiated products. And you might want to think of some examples of monopolistic competition other than the one that I gave before. Okay. And so now one of the interesting things is that differentiated goods are goods that are similar but not completely identical. So, UFC versus Northwestern, Coke versus Pepsi, Jonas Brothers versus One Direction, Wrangler jeans versus Levi's. So they're definitely, you recognize them as they are very similar, but they're not quite the same. And why are they not the same? Well, that's sort of an interesting question. What makes them different? I'm currently having my Diet Sam's Cola, which is not a perfect substitute for Diet Coke. Okay. So here's just the classic setup for perfect competition. And a couple of things are interesting about perfect competition. Many buyers, many sellers, everybody's a small player. Identical goods and services, at least within market segments. It's rare in practice, but a good baseline. One of the interesting things, by the way, about this is is there's no really interesting pricing decisions that anybody's making. And buyers and sellers they're just selling, they're just being very passive. The market's setting the price and everybody's kind of behaving accordingly. So it's obviously an oversimplification of any real market, but it's but a very useful one. So here's the firm demand curve. Very flat at the market price. You can sell any amount you want at the market price. You try to raise your price, you're not going to sell any. If you raise your price a little bit, your quantity goes to zero. It goes all the way back to here. Okay, whoops. I say it's extremely annoying that when I slide things, it wants to advance the slides as opposed to just moving the cursor around. What can I do? Apple's market power. Okay. Then there's oligopoly. So here's cell phones are a good example of that. Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile. And what's interesting is that they do differentiate themselves in the cell phone market. Verizon is more expensive, it's higher quality. And when my daughter was going to school in rural Wisconsin, I really liked having Verizon because it was better. It was also more expensive. Might think about some nonprofit examples in your world. Be curious what you come up with. And one of the striking things about oligopoly is that firms make decisions in the shadow of the likely response of their competitors. So, I'm Verizon. I decide I'm going to raise my prices. Well, part of what I'm assuming is if I raise my prices, AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile are kind of going to raise their prices in response to me. And so we'll all make more money by charging slightly higher prices. They will not use the fact that I've just raised my prices to cut theirs, and we all end up in some sort of a price war or something like that. So I'm always assuming something about how they're going to respond to me in my own behavior, with them. Now, of course, if Verizon raises its price, it's always thinking about the trade-off. It's going to lose some customers when they do that, but some customers will stay. So for example, I cared about the quality because of where my daughter was going to school. So I was going to pretty much stay if Verizon raised their prices. Plus, you might think if you're Verizon, well, the incentive to leave Verizon is not going to be as great as it might be because AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile are going to raise their prices anyway. And so there won't be a huge price difference between me and these other people once they respond to my price increase. And plus, there's also the idea that some customers are just loyal. And we may, for a whole variety of reasons, either might be expensive to switch or people just may not want to bother. For a whole variety of reasons, people may value it. By the way, imagine you're say a local restaurant. You have loyal customers. You can raise your price some, and they're not necessarily going to leave. And they might get angry with you, and at some point they might say, "Hey, I thought you were my friend. I'm done eating here because you've annoyed me by raising your prices too much." And there's a sort of social component to some of this stuff that's kind of interesting. That very often companies raise their prices and they feel like they have to give a justification to the customers. Due to rising gas prices, we've had to, or something like that. And they never say, due to the fact that we can raise our prices and make more money, we are raising our prices. That's not something that anybody ever says. But firms have a demand curve that's got some downward slope to it. Okay. So here's monopolistic competition. You're the only seller of this precise style of jeans. There's lots of different sellers, but you're the one with this particular style. Okay. And if you think about nonprofit providers, very often they're in this space. Stroger versus Rush versus UFC. Say UFC versus Northwestern. UFC has a certain reputation, certain student culture. Northwestern's is a little different, and you can imagine that that we have a slightly differentiated product. If you want to do certain majors, they're better at one university than another. This kind of thing. So competing in terms of price, real and perceived product attributes, and so on. And just some of the things that matter are your quality, your consumer service, your reputation, your location. And you say, where do these things come from? It's sort of an interesting thing. I don't know that we can always fully identify that. One of the interesting things here at Crown is, like many of the faculty, for example, have the products we buy convey a certain sense of personal identity. A lot of us don't like to shop at Walmart, partly because we think Walmart doesn't treat its workers right, partly because it just has a certain aura about what kinds of stuff is sold at Walmart that is just, there's certain class identities and biases that show up there. And some of us, like myself, are kind of reverse snobs. We don't like to shop at the places that that many of our colleagues do like to shop in. I really don't particularly like to buy high quality products, and I take great pride in buying cheaper products that are visibly lower quality, and that's sort of part of my inverse snob self-conception. And of course, location is another way that products differentiate. Yeah. And all of us as customers, we decide how much we care about these things. One of the interesting things is there's certain kinds of products that are public facing, and so Starbucks, for example, if people get a sense that Starbucks workers are poorly treated, that would really hurt Starbucks business. I think a lot of people, why am I willing to go and pay $4 for a cup of coffee? Well, I kind of think it's a nice experience, and that the people who sell it are being well treated, and I can kind of enjoy that moment. If I walked into Starbucks and I saw that the baristas were visibly unhappy, it makes a much less enjoyable experience to buy my $4 cup of coffee, and I might as well buy one at the gas station. There's certain other things that you buy where you're like, well, not like I want anybody to be mistreated in any context, but I'm not, in that moment, I'm not really thinking about the consumer experience quite as much. I'm buying some equipment, to fix my car. I'm not sort of focused so much on the way that the employees are treated. It's like, do you have the equipment that I want? I need to buy, I need to buy these spark plugs. Do you have them? And different segments, different types of products, you tend to see sort of different things motivate consumers to a greater or lesser degree. Very often, by the way, culture, peer pressure, norms play a big role here. Okay. So the ability to raise prices without losing many sales to competing sellers, as I mentioned, that's just a key thing. And what does a firm's market power depend on? How few competitors you face, and so people try to think about entering markets where they don't face a visible threat from competitors. Excuse me. How successfully you differentiate your product. Obviously, marketing plays a big role here. There's real differences, like what I really love to do is to produce a search engine the quality of Google's. That I'm sort of, I don't know that I can fully do that myself. There are real differences in quality and service, things like that. Then there's perceived differences, advertising, and very often those things are socially constructed. What is it that makes Advil different from Walgreens brand ibuprofen? There's really nothing different about them. But if you look, the packaging is different, and interestingly enough, the taste is different. And even Advil makes a lot of the store brand ibuprofens, and they make them so they taste a little different from Advil. And the idea is people want to associate that Advil taste with a high quality product that costs slightly more. Okay. So now let's talk about monopoly for a bit. And that's kind of the most basic departure. So it's the only, monopolist is the only producer of a good that has no close substitutes. Now, obviously, there's something kind of arbitrary about this. One of the things on the homework that was asked is, does Britney Spears have a monopoly on Britney Spears albums? Well, yeah, she does. I suppose you could try to fake her voice and make an album and claim to be her, but We don't really consider her to be a monopolist in that way because, there's other singers that are close substitutes for Britney Spears. She has some market power, that she has a fan base, but if she said I'm going to charge $150 for per song, she's not going to have too many people buying her songs because they're going to buy, other singers' products. Okay. So there's that. So every firm that faces a downward sloping demand curve to some extent has some market power, and you could argue to some extent is a little bit of a monopolist. But usually firms face a pretty elastic demand curve that's not that downward sloping. And one thing, you really have to look at the cross price elasticities of demand. There's no like laboratory test you can do that says somebody is a monopolist. Right now, for many, many years, there were lawsuits against Western Union arguing that it was a monopolist in the telegraph space, and it probably still is, but whoop-de-doo, it doesn't matter for anything. So you really want to look and see, are there products that are substitutes for the thing that you're selling that constrains what you can charge and the harm that you could cause to society by certain monopolistic practices. Okay. So why do monopolies exist? Obviously, a monopolist, when they do exist, they have market power and can earn profits, and then this generates a policy dilemma. But why do they exist? Usually, if a monopoly is persisting for any period of time, there's some kind of an entry barrier that prevents a competitor from coming in and bidding down the price. So one is it could be control of natural resources or inputs. If I'm Saudi Arabia, I just control a lot of petroleum that gives me market power. There's some key input that I have that nobody else has. De Beers diamonds is another example. Increasing returns to scale. I'm the water company. I've built pipes all around the entire city to every house. Boy, you're just not going to be able to compete with me very readily unless you are willing to replicate my entire, infrastructure. And wow, that's expensive. Technological superiority, either in an organizational sense or in a scientific sense. Clearly this is important. Google search is very good. Amazon has an amazing organizational technology that matters a lot in their computer servers. AWS is high technology. iPhones are pretty impressive technology, and that matters a lot. Network externalities. This is an interesting one. The idea is that the value for me as a consumer of using the product increases when other people use that same product. So imagine that I'm trying to compete with Facebook, and I come out with something that has features that are better than Facebook's. In a lot of ways, Facebook technology is not that great. I'm sort of surprised when I get on Facebook that the web interface is pretty crummy. That there's a lot of things that it's not very fast. It doesn't seem like it's super high tech in a lot of ways. But everybody that I know is on Facebook, and if you want to be on a social network site and you want to be, with your relatives and everything like that, you're going to be on Facebook. And, if somebody sets up Schmacebook and it's got a better, faster interface, but nobody that is on it, what good does it do? I must say, it'll be an interesting thing to see what happens with Twitter, because a lot of people are leaving Twitter and going to Mastodon and some other sites. And could there be some serious competition to Twitter that arises from that? So these network externalities can be a very important thing. If there's a common standard, that can be really important. For example, I'm using word processing software. Microsoft Word. One reason I use Microsoft Word is everybody else is using Microsoft Word. And, I could use, Word Perfect is just as good probably, but boy, that would be a pain in the neck to be working with people. I sometimes have co-authors who use this software called LaTeX. And it's so bad when I'm trying to work in Word and they're sending me LaTeX files and they're coming in screwed up. So those are the kinds of network externalities. I have to put that in the slide. Government created barriers. Patents and copyrights are two obvious examples of those barriers. There are others. Could be government's just a huge customer of one business rather than another, and that can generate some monopoly advantages. Violence or extra legal behavior. Drug cartels. I want to be the only person selling heroin in this place. And if you come in and try to sell heroin in this place, I will kill you. You know, that's a way you can create market power. And by the way, this is also where racist violence has played a key role in American history, where, you know, for a very long time in the American South, non-Hispanic white workers got higher wages than other workers. And you might say, how is this sustainable? Firms could have hired Black workers or Latinx workers and paid them lower wages and you know, outcompeted the people that hired the non-Hispanic white workers who were getting higher wages. Well, that doesn't work, partly because government prevented that from happening in various ways, but also because there was terrorism. And if you tried to do that, someone would come and burn down your factory, or they would come and they would burn down your house with you in it. And you know, violence is a strategy for economic competition that is, you know, that is sometimes you know, quite important. And certainly as someone of a Jewish background, I'm very well aware of many ways that this has been used against Jewish people as well, and also Asian Americans and others, you know, to prevent fair competition. Unique relationships and reputation with customers. That matters a lot, particularly if you're talking about very sensitive things, you know, like healthcare, for example. You know, you could try to suppose that I'm South Shore Hospital and I'm trying to undersell the University of Chicago for oncology care. That's going to be really hard to do, partly because of reputation, but partly also just because UFC has a lot of people that have been getting cancer care here for years. And, you know, it's going to be really hard to get people to move. And that matters. And, you know, it is, I've been using my iPhone for years. The idea of switching to a Google phone and having to screw around with it to reconfigure everything, I just don't want to do it. And it probably would take me not very much time, but I'm just don't feel like doing that. And that sort of switching costs, you know, are important. And you might want to give some examples of each of these things in your own lives as you think about this. So here's just the network externality examples. I think I've already beaten this one to death, but you might want to think about other examples of this. And Twitter obviously is another one. Here's a good thing for a breakout that you guys can do. So you just divide up into a bunch of groups and think about, is each of these a monopoly and in what way? And what is a sensible policy response to each of these things? And the Mayo Clinic, you know, just one of the nation's premier hospitals in Rochester, Minnesota, Amazon, Facebook, Google, a large and influential public employee union. I must say, by the way, when I tell this story to my Crown students, if I say police unions, I get a very different answer than if I say, you know, or prison guard unions. I get a very different answer than if I say, how about teachers unions or AFSCME and SEIU? But, you know, these are powerful entities in economics and politics. Or a large influential private union like the United Auto Workers. Are they a monopoly? A little unclear. So I'm curious what you guys have to say about these. Does a pharmaceutical company have a monopoly on a breakthrough patented cancer drug? How about a not so breakthrough patented mild improvement? We've talked about this in class, but it's interesting examples. The certainly if the government allows you to have a long patent on each of these, then you know, then you do have a monopoly of sorts. From a public policy perspective, there's an argument for this one, that you've created an incentive to develop the patented breakthrough drug. This one down here seems like a complete waste of money and just overcharging consumers for something that is not valuable. So from a policy point of view, you might say, well, we do want to have patents for drugs, but let's kind of make sure that they're really only going to the breakthroughs that really have tremendous social value. Someone who figures out some new biological mechanism to fight cancer and develops a great drug for that, you know, let's make sure they make a lot of money for that. Someone develops an mRNA vaccine that protects people against COVID. You definitely want people to make a lot of money from that. Some of this other stuff, not so much. And now, if you say, do they have a monopoly on these drugs? Sort of interesting. You have to say, well, what's the extent of the market? What are the potential substitutes? Things like that. And one of the interesting challenges to monopoly that comes from the tech world is a lot of the behaviors that are really most concerning are not traditional monopoly behaviors of the sort that we might have had with like Standard Oil in 1900. So, so for example, if you say Facebook, they're bringing, they're doing these predatory practices that hurt consumers, and Facebook says, wait a minute, it's free to, our product is free to the user. Amazon, their prices are low, and same with Walmart. So it's some very interesting things. And then there's things that these companies do that aren't real monopoly issues, but they're troubling issues. So like Google's predatory way that they sell consumers private information. I don't know that that's a monopoly issue, but it's a corporate conduct issue that might require regulation. And folks have seen that Google was recently fined for tracking people in a way that was unethical. There economies of scale. This is usually called natural monopoly. So there's a large cost advantage to having all of an industry's output produced by a single firm. The phone company, power company, things like that. Some of these things can change, by the way, over time. But there's something where there's a very high fixed cost. Like I put in water pipes around the city, and so average total cost tends to decline as you sort of expand how many people are hooked up. Once I have this whole network, hooking up another house is pretty cheap. And so that means that there's a huge barrier to entry to anybody coming in and competing with the water company. They probably need to have one water company whose price is regulated. Now, I should say this stuff changes over time due to technology. So the biggest monopoly in American history pretty much was the AT&T phone network, where you had one company that was providing basically all the phone service in the United States. And then that really changed a lot when cell phones came out, because you didn't need to wire up everything. You could just set up phone towers, and then lots of companies could come in and compete. And we now, phone service is now quite competitive. So the technology changed, and that eliminated the need for that huge fixed cost, which then gave one firm a big advantage. So here's an example of a natural monopoly and sort of how its demand and pricing stuff works. So here's the demand curve. Here's its average total cost curve, which is declining. At least at some point, it may start to rise. You may hit a bottleneck eventually, but it's declining over the relevant range given the market. And so what a regulator wants to do is a regulator wants to say, okay, you're going to have to charge right here. So you're just going to get your opportunity cost back as a big firm. And we're going to force you to price here. And if you set this price here, then you'd be right on the demand curve at this point. And that's their break-even price. Now, of course, the firm does not want to charge there. The firm really wants to charge something up here, right? There's some point up here where it's going to make positive profits. So you have to regulate that monopolist to force them to price here. And that's really a big challenge, by the way, because it's not like this curve, you can just like Google this curve and know what it is. This is somehow coming from observing the company, from getting accounting reports from the company, doing modeling, that kind of thing. So the regulators are always kind of guessing what this is. One of the things that regulators do, by the way, is they look very carefully at the stock prices of companies. And if they find that the stock price of a company is really going up, very often that's a sign, oh, their average total cost they must have some opportunities to lower that average total cost that we haven't thought about. Because, from the firm's perspective, if the true average total cost curve was really sort of down here, then if you allow them to price here, they're making money. So there's a lot of sort of cat and mouse stuff going on in regulation, particularly because the public regulators, they regulate these utilities. Where do you think they get a lot of their campaign contributions from and stuff like that? You can imagine there's a lot of issues of regulatory capture. But this is the basic setup of a natural monopoly. You've got the declining average total cost over the relevant range. It's a single firm, and this is kind of the ideal place to charge from a social perspective. And you don't want lots of small firms because their average total cost would be just too high. You need one firm can do this very efficiently. Now, the price-taking firm's optimal output rule is to produce at the output level where the marginal cost is equal to the market price. So they're only thinking about the quantity effect when they're making pricing decisions. There's no price effect if you have no market power. A monopolist, though, is the sole supplier of the good. So its demand curve is just the market demand curve, which is downward sloping. Okay? And that creates a wedge between the price of the good and the marginal revenue. The marginal revenue of the good is a little bit below the market price, because what happens when you produce one more unit, you get a quantity effect, but you're also having to drag the price down a little bit so that you can sell that additional output. So beating a dead horse here, but here's the distinction. That you're thinking about, where do I want to price given that I have a downward sloping demand curve. So, the discount effect or the price effect matters. And this is where, by the way, note that we're assuming that the monopolist is selling all the goods at the same price. If you can charge different prices to different consumers, obviously this gets a little more complicated. So, for example, if I have high quality products and low quality products, I might be able to have a more complicated pricing strategy, and we'll talk about that later. Okay. So, by the way, there's one fun, awesome fact. If the demand curve is linear, the marginal revenue always has the same y-intercept as the firm's demand curve, but it actually comes down at twice the slope. That's actually a cool fact. It comes out of basic calculus, but it just turned out to be true. That here's just a classic example. Here's a monopolist, and they've got a demand curve that kind of comes down like that. And then they've got a marginal revenue curve, starts at exactly the same y-intercept, and it just comes down at twice the slope. And that's kind of an awesome thing. And by the way, in this particular example, if I just keep hitting the advance key, you see that if I start with a super high price, as I lower the price, I'm going to make more money. If I charge a super high price, if I charge $1,000, I don't sell anything. I start lowering the price, and as I lower the price, the quantity effect is dominating, and I'm making more money. But at some point, I get up here, and then if I if I keep lowering my price, now the price effect dominates, and now it's too cheap. It's coming down like that. So, depending on where you start your pricing, there's some people, when they think about how a monopolist should price, you could talk about this bottom graph either way. You can say, I want to start with a super low price, and I just keep increasing my price. As I increase my price, the price effect is dominating as long as the demand is pretty inelastic. But at some point, I get up here, at some point I'm raising my price and lots of people stop buying, and then the quantity effect is dominating and my price is too high. So there's a bliss point where the price and the quantity effect are in the proper balance, somewhere right around here. They're at low levels of output, the quantity effect is going to be stronger than the price effect, right? If I do something that just allows a little bit more to be sold, well, that quantity effect is going to be big. and I'm only lowering my price on a few units in order to sell a little more, so the price effect is pretty small. But if I've got really high levels of output, the opposite's happening. If I lower my price a little bit, wow, I've hurt myself on all the units that I'm selling. And yeah, okay, I might be selling a few more units because I've lowered the price a little bit. It's not worth it. So it's sort of really high output levels. It turns out that the price effect tends to dominate. So you're always, and as always in the course, you're always comparing marginal costs and marginal revenue. And the marginal revenue includes the price effect and the quantity effect embedded in that same thing. And that's why it comes down with a steeper slope, because it's got that price effect in there. So if marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost, you're going to produce a little more. That means that every time I produce one more unit, I'm getting more revenue that's coming in from that last unit than it's costing me to do that. If marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, then cutting back makes more sense. So that's what the monopolist like De Beers Diamonds is going to be doing. And at the profit maximizing quantity, you get to marginal revenue and marginal cost exactly offset each other. As we talked about previously in the course, if you're in a fully competitive market, this marginal revenue is just the market price. How much, if I produce one more unit, how much more ends up in my cash register? Just whatever, if the price of minivans is $35,000, I make one more minivan, I get $35,000 in my cash register. I'm a small player. I'm not affecting the market price of minivans at all. I'm just producing one more. Okay. So like here's, let me see if I hit advance enough time so I can get the full things. So here we have a diamond example. So in this particular thing, we're just assuming that there's a flat cost. It costs $200 to produce a diamond. And I've got a demand curve and I've got a marginal revenue curve that goes with it. So the demand curve comes down at twice the slope. So the point where the quantity where marginal cost equals marginal revenue is right at this point, 8 diamonds. At this point, at 8, you say, what does the price have to be so that I sell exactly 8? That's this point on the demand curve, $600. Now, what's the monopolist profit? The monopolist profit is its markup, which is $600, how much it charges minus how much it costs to produce each diamond, which is $200. So it's earning $400 per diamond, and it's selling 8 diamonds. So we take 200 times 8, and we've got the profit. By the way, what do you think the deadweight loss is? The deadweight loss is this consumer surplus triangle that never gets to happen. So, if we were truly in an efficient market, we'd actually be, diamonds would cost $200 and you'd be selling basically right about here. And so this entire triangle of consumer surplus gets vaporized because the price is too high. This monopoly profit thing is actually not an inefficiency from the social perspective. It's just money that's taken from consumers and given to producers. But this lost consumer surplus, that is a true social cost. Okay? When marginal cost is completely flat, very trivial thing to work with. Okay? Okay? And by the way, I have this interactive that you can play with and just see how it goes. Okay? Now let's think about a little bit more complicated example. So here we have a monopolist, got a demand curve, and we'll say it's linear, and they've got a marginal revenue curve that comes down at twice the slope. But now they've got an average total cost curve that's got a nice curviness to it, and they've got a marginal cost curve that's got a curviness to it. And of course, the marginal cost curve hits this at its minimum. But then we think, what's the monopolist going to do? She's going to look at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and that's actually right at this point A. And that's the quantity that the monopolist is going to produce. At that quantity, the price has to be right up here, the monopoly price. That's just the price at which you'll sell this preferred quantity. And at this price, the profit that the company is going to make is the price that it gets on each unit minus its average total cost for each unit. If on average it costs it $200 to produce a diamond and it's selling them for $600, this distance might be $400. And then you multiply by how many units you're selling, each of which is getting that same markup. By the way, the deadweight loss triangle is going to be this thing in here. Difference between the marginal cost curve and the demand curve to the right of the monopoly value, production value. Okay? So that's what the monopolist is doing. And again, the idea is, if I'm going to get $35 in my cash register by producing another sneaker, I keep producing sneakers until the marginal cost of producing another sneaker crosses up that $35 amount. Okay? Here's a good thing you can do in class with the interactive, and just practice and just see where it goes. Remember you can use my my interactive, which is right here. And I encourage you to just play with it. It's not the world's greatest thing, but it's useful to play with. Okay. By the way, you might want to look and see what happens if you make the demand curve less elastic and see how it might be different. So 100 minus P versus 100 minus a half P. Let's see what's different there. And also see what happens if you change the monopolist fixed costs, which change the average total cost curve, although that doesn't change anything else. Okay. Is there a monopoly supply curve? No, that's sort of an interesting thing. You might say, where's the supply curve for the monopolist? They don't really have one. They just respond to the demand curve. It's a single firm, and it just optimizes its decision given the demand curve. Okay. Because remember, the supply curve is the quantity that producers are willing to supply at any given market price, but the monopolist doesn't take the prices given. It chooses a profit maximizing quantity, knowing that its own decisions affect the price. So it's a different situation. Okay. Okay. Now again, how does price elasticity of demand matter? A monopolist faces marginal revenue that's less than the market price, but how much lower? That answer depends on the price elasticity of demand. If you have a really elastic demand curve, then the marginal revenue is way below the market price. If I try to lower my price a little bit and consumers are sort of super price sensitive, I'm just going to lose a lot of business. Okay? So what firms do is they keep raising their, what monopoly firms does is it keeps raising its price until it really starts to lose a lot of customers. So you're always trying to price on a pretty elastic part of the demand curve, because if you were on an inelastic part of the demand curve, you could just raise your prices and you wouldn't lose very much business. Okay? But similar principles apply when government sets tax rates, which is sort of interesting. You don't set a high sales tax on goods that are very price elastic. One of the reasons why we have high taxes locally on gasoline and cigarettes is that those things the demand is pretty price inelastic for those things. And if I try to put a very high sales tax on some luxury good where there's a pretty elastic demand, I'm just not going to make much money in my sales tax. So like fancy restaurant meals, if I try putting a high tax on those, which would be very satisfying from a distributional perspective and from a Herald perspective, since I don't like to eat expensive meals, it's hard to make money on those as a taxing authority because people just don't go out as often, things like that. Yeah. By the way, when a demand is very price inelastic, sales taxes also don't create very much deadweight loss. So there's an efficiency advantage from that as well. Okay. Although, as I mentioned, create some distributional issues. Now, one thing that is one of the challenges that this really raises for progressive governance is that if you want to have a large public sector that's providing for a lot of people's basic needs, you need to raise a lot of money through taxes. And very often what you find is something like for example, the Bernie Sanders Medicare for All proposal basically required, the amount of revenue required was equivalent to doubling the federal income tax. And so, wow, that's a big challenge. And a lot of countries that do things like that, they do have very high taxes, very often on necessities that people that people have inelastic demand for. And so there is there are some trade-offs in that if you have a very large public sector, you have to have very burdensome taxes to support that, and you have to decide how you're going to do that. Monopoly and public prices. So as I mentioned, monopoly creates deadweight loss, and government policies try to prevent that. Okay? So when monopolies are sort of created, governments try to prevent that from happening, and they try to break up existing monopolies when they can. Okay? And of course, this is antitrust policies that I'm talking about. Okay? Now, there's some good things about monopoly I should mention. One of the ironic things is that in the case of carbon, high prices are good. One of the best things that's happened to climate change recently is the war in Ukraine and the ridiculous increase in the price of fuel. And if an oil cartel is keeping prices above its competitive level, people are going to use less of that resource, and if that resource is creating a lot of pollution or other problems, that's kind of a good thing. Also, monopolies often share rents with workers and other shareholders. I grew up in Rochester, New York, when the Kodak film was an incredibly profitable thing. And the whole city of Rochester, Kodak Bonus Day was just a great day for every business in Rochester. Kodak workers earned really good wages. Kodak was a very was a good local citizen in a lot of ways. In fact, they had a number of anti-racist efforts in Kodak that were before their time, although also fell short in a lot of other ways. Monopolies may be more socially conscious than other firms. Now that's an important maybe, but sometimes that's true. For example, Facebook really does not want to have hate speech on its platform. That's bad for its reputation. It's bad for its business. And also Facebook employees don't want that. And so Facebook does things to try to suppress hate speech. It's very, very often when you're in a really competitive, perfect competition type situation, you go to the lowest common denominator on everything. And one of the striking things is that monopolies have big political incentives to be viewed as positive actors. And also, they often split some of the profits with organized labor. If you want to unionize an industry, unionizing a profitable industry is going to get you much more economic return than unionizing a very, very competitive industry. Some monopolies also support useful innovations. I mentioned AT&T when they had this incredible phone monopoly. That's where the transistor was invented. AT&T Bell Labs did a lot of great stuff. IBM researchers won many Nobel Prizes. Part of it is just a huge company derives more of the benefit when they come up with a basic innovation. And also they have a public reputation that is enhanced. Bell Labs actually, their researchers won Nobel Prizes for finding the background radiation from the Big Bang at the origin of the universe. And I think part of the reason AT&T subsidized stuff like that is it was good for its reputation. Monopolists can subsidize some consumers at the expense of others. The old phone system subsidized rural customers quite heavily, and also did things to help low-income or disabled customers. And the post office, of course, still does that. Now, that's some of the good stuff about being a monopoly. There's a lot of bad stuff, too. One is that firms have very strong incentives to manipulate public policies to earn monopoly or extra market returns. That's often called rent-seeking behavior. And, who is it that contributes a lot to politicians? That's very often it's firms that have market power and want to have more market power. Monopolists also can discourage innovation that competes with their core products. In fact, AT&T had cell phones on the shelf for years. They just didn't want to develop it. It competed with their core product. Same with Kodak film. Kodak had from a lot of digital technologies that they just never deployed. Although as it turned out in the long run, that killed the company because somebody else did that. One of the striking things, if you look in Washington, D.C., is how many of the defense contractors are lobbying Congress to buy weapons that the Defense Department doesn't even want. Very, very expensive new fighter planes that just are not needed. But of course, firms lobby for that. Pretty much you see any company that advertises on like Meet the Press, something like that, I always take that as a sign they're getting something that they shouldn't be getting. And also, regulated industries can use public regulation itself to charge higher prices. And and I mentioned the airline example, but you might think about what are some other examples of that. And then there's also the problem that just monopoly produces enormous wealth and people that have too much social and political power in a democracy. And do we really want to have private individuals with $300 billion? There's some definite problems with that, and to the extent that that's linked to monopoly, that can be a real issue. And monopolies cause inefficiency. So here's a case where we have a demand curve and we have perfect competition. Okay, so here's the market demand curve. Here's the marginal cost of producing a good. Competitive market is basically going to end up here. And there's a lot of consumer surplus there. Well, that's not where the monopolist wants to end up. The monopolist wants to end up at some higher price point, and it's going to create some deadweight loss, right? So this is what the monopolist is doing, finding that marginal revenue equals marginal cost point, and creates this whole triangle of deadweight loss, and also transfers a lot of money from consumers to the firm. So, but this thing here is inefficiency. Okay? And it's really coming from the monopoly behavior. And one of the striking things is that in recent years, antitrust enforcement has really declined. And we see this in local and cable TV. We see this in airlines. I was actually once at a lunch at the Chicago Club, and I was listening to some airline executives talking about how they had contributed a lot of money to local mayors who were in the flight path from heading out of O'Hare Airport, and how they were using that to prevent other airlines from coming in. And also, by the way, using that to prevent those towns from making noise complaints about O'Hare. It was quite something listening to that. And regulators have not been very effective in dealing with some of the network externality issues. So I was actually talking with a friend of mine who founded a media company, and he was telling me that their entire business model at the time was everybody's coming from Facebook, so we have to design our product to look great when it's accessed through Facebook. And there's a couple of problems with that. One is, they actually said it wasn't always the greatest technology from the point of view of what they were trying to do, presenting news stories and things like that. But also, of course, it gives Facebook an even greater advantage because now everybody's designing their products to look great when you're going through Facebook. So if I'm trying to design something that competes with Facebook, all of a sudden, other products that the person's using aren't going to look as good because everything's been optimized to Facebook, and that becomes a barrier to entry. And of course, public sector plays a big role. The United States government supports Boeing. The French government and others supports Airbus. European regulatory authorities have really tried hard to fight American technological supremacy in the tech space. Fights with Google are a classic example. And China is a really interesting thing. First of all, the Chinese government often acts as a monopsonist in negotiating access to Chinese domestic markets, but also the Chinese government wants to systematically extract American technology. And there's some really interesting dilemmas there where they'll say to an American company, you can sell Boeing, you want to sell airlines to us. Okay, you can sell planes to us, but here's the technology that you have to share with us. And you have to build in China the following facilities so that we can learn to do that. And of course, eventually that's going to be Boeing's future competitor. Okay? Then there's also other things that are in some ways are more mundane, but can be more harmful. So there's barbershops can lobby local legislators to require licensing of barbers. That's a barrier to entry. A lot of states have all sorts of requirements that say that a dental hygienist is not allowed to fill a cavity or clean somebody's teeth unless they are under the supervision of a dentist. There's really no reason for that, except that dentists have been able to lobby state legislators to do that. Or car companies cannot sell directly to consumers. They have to go through local dealers. The dealers are basically using the public sector to reduce competition. Okay. Different ways to prevent monopoly. So one thing is how do you handle a natural monopoly? You can't always break those up because sometimes that creates more inefficiency, but you may want to regulate the prices that are charged. There's no perfect way around that. You definitely have to regulate a profit maximizing monopolist, even a natural monopolist. And it's a challenge. Here's just some examples of market power. Many more examples in everyday life. These are just some of many. Here's one that I find particularly galling, is the monopoly that jail and prison phone vendors have. Calls from prisons can be quite expensive. So a 15-minute collect call can cost $20. I must say this is getting somewhat better because the public is becoming so angry about it. It's been a real issue, and especially if you think, well, people in prison, you really want people to be connected with their families while they're in a correctional setting. And it's really, it's really pretty terrible that people, that incarcerated people and their loved ones are paying huge amounts of money for this. And very often there's a single telephone company that has that contract. Often, by the way, a company you've never heard of, which I think is kind of interesting. And they have enormous market power. And of course, people who are incarcerated, politically are a very weak constituency. So you can get away with some of this behavior that if you tried to do it in, say, a nursing home, people would come and kill you. And so there are charities that help pay for people's phone calls. Interesting question you might think about. Why is it that these are often companies you've never heard of? You go into Midway Airport, the restaurant that charges $12 for a sandwich is very often one you've never heard of. How can they do that? And who's really benefiting from that? It's worth thinking about. Dunkin' Donuts does not charge you $7 for a donut in the airport, which maybe they could do. It's sort of interesting. Now, the new generation of market power is the tech space is a little complicated. I mentioned, Microsoft, there's network externalities and word processing and spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides. There's Apple and Google have equivalent, Uber and PayPal, things like that. And, and these are some interesting challenges that we have. So, here's some examples here. One of the striking things that Google and Amazon can do is they can use their role as a bottleneck. So one of the things that's really troubling about Amazon is that what Amazon can do is, suppose I want to sell umbrellas on the web. I have Harold's Umbrella Company. I pretty much have to sell on Amazon if I'm going to sell a lot of umbrellas, because nobody's going to come to Harold's Umbrella website by itself. So I get on Amazon and I sell my umbrellas as part of the Amazon marketplace. Well, there's a couple things that I'm doing when I do that. One is I have to pay Amazon for that. But the second is Amazon has access to all my data and they can see who's coming to my site. And if they find, a lot of people are buying Harold's umbrellas, then Amazon can say, oh, maybe Amazon Basics should make an umbrella that looks a lot like Harold's umbrella. And maybe I should put Amazon Basic umbrella just a little bit above Harold on the when I'm getting on Amazon to search around for stuff. And they are able to leverage their dominance in distribution into dominance in the production of the product. Also, monopsony issues can create other problems. And similar stories can be told. Microsoft trying to nudge everybody into the Microsoft web browsers, for example. Google can try to hinder its rivals because everyone's using the Google search engine to find their rivals. And that's obviously a challenge. And on this bottom one, the monopsony one, Walmart, because it's such a huge buyer, can get lower prices than other of its competitors. And it can also say things like, oh, you want to sell Vlasic pickles at Walmart. Well, if you want to do that, don't sell it to Target. Let's make this exclusive to Walmart. And if Walmart is big enough, you can imagine that they're in a position to do that, and now they've hurt Target. That if I'm the pickle company, I just have to be selling at Walmart, and even though I might have made some money selling at Target, it wasn't worth it if that would have shut me out of Walmart. So, the classic example of monopsony would be a single employer in a small town. Clearly there's, cable TV is one of the areas where there's very strong attention to monopoly issues. I must say, by the way, this slide's a little old. I don't think that we have to care too much about breaking up eBay these days, or PayPal for that matter. But some of these other ones are a little bit more questionable. You might think about the pros and cons of breaking up Facebook, Microsoft, Apple. I was pretty concerned when I have an old laptop from Apple, and they refused to repair it for me. And they said there was water damage. But I think the real thing that they were saying was, we'd like you to buy it. It's not worth it to us to repair your Apple laptop. We'd like you to buy a new one. So we just don't repair the old ones. And there's a bunch of issues of that nature that have arisen with each of these companies. And they really, I think that particularly Apple tends to have a very positive brand identity. So does Google. These are not charitable enterprises. None of them are. And none of them are, they're not horrible. They're not evil institutions, but they often do things that are harmful to the public as a way to, as part of their profit maximization. Now I want to talk about price discrimination. So far we've assumed that our firm is a single price monopolist. It offers its product to all consumers at the same price. Clearly, sometimes that's not the right strategy. So, I think I've mentioned in class multiple times because of my reverse snobbery that I went to Paris and I paid $800 for a basic economy ticket. And way up in the front of the plane, there were people that were paying $6,000 for a first class ticket. And one of the striking things, by the way, about this was the marketing materials for the basic economy seat that I had seemed to intentionally emphasize how low quality it was, how you're not allowed to bring a bag in and put it in the upper compartment. You have to check your bag. And they really emphasize, you don't get to pick your seat. And of course, what they're trying to do is make sure that people who are willing to pay more money for that ticket wouldn't try to buy the basic economy ticket, which was cheaper. When I got on the plane, as far as I could tell, my basic economy seat was, except for the fact that I had to check my bag, was identical to what everybody else had in coach. And it's true that I did not have a warm towel, in first class. I couldn't recline my seat all the way. I was quite happy that I didn't pay $5,200 for those luxury amenities. So let's think about price discrimination a bit. remember, calling, the profit maximization rule was basically pick marginal revenue equals marginal cost and charge as much as the market will bear. It's found by the position of the demand curve. Now, there's a bunch of assumptions going on in these equations that are making a pretty uniform decision. Suppose I'm selling to more than one market, each of which has its own demand curve. So, I'm on my airline, I've got senior citizens and young people, business travelers and leisure travelers. Of course, clearly these people lead to prices being too high and quality being too high too, for one obvious reason. What's that reason? They're not paying with their own money. Clearly there's a bunch of young students, so in the basic economy area, quite a few of the people sitting near me were young people, and they were just like, I just want to I want to go to France. I don't want to pay a lot of money for it. And I'm 22 years old. I don't have a lot of money to waste on a sort of super luxurious flight experience. And then in the business class and first class, of course, that's where a ton of people were. Some of them, by the way, were employees of the University of Chicago who were using U of C travel money to do this trip that I was on. I felt a real sense of smug moral superiority over that and tried not to notice that I also had a super expensive camera lens in my bag that other people didn't have. So here's an example of price discrimination where I've basically got a demand curve that kind of looks like this staircase here. So what I really would love to do is charge these people $550 and charge these people $150. Okay? Now, by the way, you might think about, how do I do that? There's some interesting strategic questions. How do I really create this separation? One thing, how do I make sure these people don't sort of sneak into the first class area? But I've got to do something that makes it possible for me to have such a large difference in how much I'm charging people. So if I make these somehow, there's got to be something that I'm doing that encourages people to pay this higher price in some way. Okay? But I notice that when I can do that, one of the groups of people that is the most happy about price discrimination are these people here. The student travelers, essentially their flight's being cross-subsidized by the business travelers. The business travelers are paying a lot of the fixed costs of the flight. So, if you are a student traveler and you're looking up into the first class cabin and you're seeing someone who's getting this beautiful meal that you're not getting, and someone's bringing out a hot towel, and the people in first class are getting massage, doing whatever, you should feel really good, because basically those people are paying a lot of money for that experience, and they're helping to pay the cost of your flight. And when you sort of have to pull out your 6-inch Subway sub that you bought at O'Hare Airport before getting on the plane instead of the fancy meal, you should feel really good about that, because wow, those people in first class who are getting a nice meal are paying literally like $900 for that meal, and that's okay, maybe $500, but that's really quite crazy. Okay? So firms try to distinguish between groups of customers on the basis of price elasticity. And I should say also quality preferences. That's kind of implicit in the story I was telling about the first class and so on. You could imagine that I can offer a higher quality version of the product at a higher price. So I've got my software, and I've got the student version, and I've got the business version. And the business version allows me, let's say it's some sort of data statistics package. The business version allows me to have larger data sets and has some nice graphical features that the student version doesn't have. The truth is, I could stick that in the student version for zero marginal cost, but I don't want to do that because I want to prevent, people that want that feature, I want them to spend more money and buy the business version. So I'm doing something to keep a quality difference between the student version and the business version. And the idea is that the students are essentially more price sensitive than the business people. So, fares are higher if you don't stay over Saturday night. That's a business traveler thing. Fares might be higher if you get to choose your own seat or you get to choose what time you leave. I don't know if you've used Priceline, but you're not allowed to know exactly when your flight leaves on some of these services. And they're reducing the quality of the experience so that only the people that really are the most price sensitive are going to buy tickets that way. So here's a good example. Person A reserves a car online weeks before a trip. Person B walks up to a Hertz counter after he walks off an airplane. Who probably has a more elastic demand for a Hertz rental car and who probably gets charged more? Let's think about all these different possibilities. How many people say D? That is, in fact, the correct answer. Partly because person A is really planning ahead. They can comparison shop. Clearly, if Hertz tries to charge a lot more money, they're going to just order online from Avis. Person B, they like need the car now. So they are really stuck. Okay. Of course, the answer is D. I got it right. Of course. They're so you always, you want to make sure that you are not person B in a lot of settings. Planning ahead allows you to be more strategic, but it also puts you in a group of people who are likely to be more price sensitive and therefore who get better prices. Here's price discrimination. Increases sales and profits. Oops. So here we have two prices. Got a price here, we got a price here. So what's happening is, there's clearly higher profits because for all of these high value customers, the producer is getting the difference in price on every unit that's sold to those people. So this whole rectangle is extra profit because I'm charging more to the high value customers. And the more I can price discriminate, the more I can benefit from that. So here we got three classes of customers. By the way, notice here the deadweight loss is starting to get smaller because there's a group of customers out here that are very price sensitive to. I'll charge them a low price if there's a way I can distinguish those. So from a social perspective, this high degree of price discrimination may actually be better than a uniform price. I must say this is very often, though, when firms do this, they can sometimes run into public anger, depending on how they discriminate. If you discriminate against business travelers in terms of your pricing, nobody cares that much, although people are irritated that business travelers are having a better experience. But if you are charging a lot more money to people who are in greater need in some way, sometimes there's a public backlash. And it's like charging more money after the storm. I'm raising the price of eggs right after there's been a big snowstorm. People don't like that. And there's people have a sense of ethics that doesn't particularly always line up with the supply and demand diagrams and economic efficiency. And if I say people who are really sick have a high willingness to pay for medicine, a lot of Americans would say that is true. And if you try to take advantage of that, boy, we are going to hurt you because we think that you're trying to exploit people who are sick. And so there are social norms and political norms and legal restrictions that sometimes limit price discrimination. And in American history, by the way, one of the big issues that came up was how many times monopolists wanted to pursue a pretty economically efficient approach, but that would result in them charging higher prices to small farmers than to larger businesses. I say like railroads that were traveling wheat, they were taking wheat from Kansas to the East Coast. That the economic efficient thing to do was actually to charge pretty high cargo charges to farmers in Kansas. And it was actually cheaper to ship something from Los Angeles to New York than it was from Kansas to New York. Boy, that created a huge backlash. There's perfect price discrimination. You just charge every customer what they're willing to pay. By the way, haggling at a flea market, you kind of get to that. People are really good at haggling. They will pay the minimum that they're willing to pay. They're a customer. And of course, it creates less deadweight loss because the consumers that are the most price elastic, will end up paying the lowest prices in general. By the way, this looks a lot like something that you've experienced in your own lives, and I'll get to that in a minute. Here's perfect price discrimination. There's no deadweight loss at all. You just charge every customer what they're willing to pay. There's zero consumer surplus because the entire surplus is captured by a monopolist, but there's no inefficiency. So there's a distributional issue, but there's no inefficiency. Common methods of price discrimination, advanced purchase restrictions, volume discounts. These are clearly ways to try to get to the more elastic customers. Two-part tariffs, you pay a flat fee up front and then a per unit fee on each item purchased. You might want to think about why that is a good way to do price discrimination. Sales and outlet stores are kind of interesting. I set up I set up an outlet store that's pretty, that's 30 miles west of Chicago. My most price sensitive customers are going to drive out there, but a lot of other people will not. Okay? And digital personalized pricing. One of the things that's striking to me is if you're buying hotel rooms on a place like hotels.com, different people are given different prices for hotel rooms. There's algorithms within the service that tell you how much they know something about your purchasing history, and that influences the prices that they put up for hotel rooms for you. And if I have a history of spending a lot of money on hotel rooms, they're going to offer me pretty expensive hotel rooms. If I don't, they may offer me a hotel. I may be offered the same room in the same hotel at a lower price because they know I'm unlikely to buy it at the higher price. And I found my niece and I was helping her get some hotel rooms, and she was getting different prices than I was on hotels.com. It was kind of striking. Now, it's not illegal to be a monopoly. There are firms that are monopolists. And sometimes they get broken up, but it's not illegal inherently to be a monopoly. There are arguments for it, but it is illegal to attempt to monopolize. And so there's a number of practices here that are illegal, and they're typically designed. The belief is that I'm basically driving out competitors and then I'm going to overcharge my customers. But here are things that are considered to be exclusionary or predatory practices: requiring suppliers not to sell to your competitors, requiring stores not to stock competitors, using monopoly power in one industry to gain it in another, requiring customers to buy your other goods, or using control over bottleneck in production, distribution, or marketing processes. Sorry, pardon the typo there. As I said, this is a big one in tech. Amazon and Google and Facebook, they are gatekeepers, and that allows them to exploit their dominance in one market to do well in another. Apple, if you want to, the Apple Store, a lot of people's entertainment products are bought through the Apple Store. Now, low prices rarely lead government to intervene, and And this is an interesting issue, because partly the idea is that, you might say, well, monopoly is achieving the thing that we want competition to do, but there's a couple of minuses to it. One is it could be a way of eliminating competitors, or it could be that we're looking at the wrong thing. So, Facebook is free to consumers, but Facebook charges really high prices to advertisers. And so we're thinking in the wrong way about who the real customers are of Facebook. I am the product when I'm a Facebook user. Facebook's customer, is anybody that's buying an ad on Facebook. And some of the things that Facebook does, they do take advantage of that monopoly power, that control over that bottleneck. And we might think about other examples. Government outlaws some strategies that create market power. So collusion is illegal, although particularly when it's explicit. Now, there are some exceptions. For example, Major League Baseball is considered to be one company. We don't sort of say the Phillies and the Mets are sort of colluding when they get together and do stuff. Blocking uncompetitive mergers. Government doesn't really know how to handle market power that's exercised by government. And one big reason why a hamburger is expensive at Midway Airport is that the monopolist is not the hamburger place, it's the city of Chicago that controls Midway Airport and charges ridiculous rents if you want to sell a hamburger at Midway Airport. The big hospital chain, Partners Healthcare in Boston, has annual revenues that exceed the combined annual budget of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the World Health Organization. That's one hospital network in Boston, centered in Boston. And 30 hospitals in America have annual revenues that exceed $2 billion each. This was actually done, I made this 2 years ago. I'm sure it's worse now. That they are, we don't as a society know how to deal with some of these behaviors. If you say, why is American healthcare costs, why are those costs so high? It's because places like the University of Chicago Hospital, Mass General Hospital, charge a lot for their services. And we don't quite know how to deal with that as a society. They're not, it's kind of hard to say that they're the villains in the same way that Facebook is a villain, or Standard Oil is a villain, or Exxon. But wow, they really, that's a big reason why American healthcare costs are so high. International trade fosters competition. That's one way we can deal with some of these issues, although it doesn't help us, with the burger at the airport or the hospital, but it helps with some things. We look at how to tell if a merger is anti-competitive. So a competitive merger could be good for consumers and bad for your rivals. So how can we tell if something's going to be bad for your rivals or good for your rivals? Look at their stock price when a merger is announced. If Delta stock goes up the day that a merger is announced between American and United or something like that, probably an anti-competitive merger. It's basically saying once these two firms merge, price competition is going to be reduced. Okay? It's sort of, if you look at the stock prices of the competitors when a potential merger is announced, and that often tells you something about whether it's a pro-competitive or an anti-competitive merger. And stock prices are just a really interesting way of at least seeing, this is what people who own capital, what they think is going to happen. They think Delta's going to become more profitable, which basically is a way of saying they think that the other airlines are going to charge higher prices, or in some way or another, going to make it easier for Delta to do that. Yeah. So, here's just the example. American Airlines US Air merger, when it was canceled, rival stocks went down. How can we minimize harm from firms that exercise market power? One is we just explicitly regulate prices. Probably something we should do more in healthcare. Not always possible to do, but it is sometimes appropriate. create countervailing power among purchasers. That's the basic strategy behind single payer and the public options. There's some pluses and minuses to that. You're giving a huge amount of power to a government entity, for example, in single payer. And you have to raise tax revenue to pay for that. But it would be able to squeeze the supply side of the medical marketplace to get lower prices. Very interesting costs and benefits there. Now, one practical problem, if laws link prices to marginal costs, as in like public utilities, ironically, it reduces the incentives for firms to keep their marginal costs low. And it eliminates the incentives they might otherwise have to increase quality. One of the problems we have in public utilities is they're very inefficient because they're basically a cost plus pricing. Same with defense contractors. If you say, I'm going to pay you 110% of your cost to produce fighter planes, you have zero incentive to produce fighter planes efficiently. At least once you have the contract. But quite the opposite. If it becomes more expensive, you're now getting 110% of a bigger number. So some takeaways. So imperfect competition is more relevant empirically than perfect competition. Market power is the ability to raise prices without losing too many customers to competitors. Discount effect. When we have an uncompetitive situation, production is too low relative to the optimum. And by the way, inefficient firms can survive, unlike in the case of perfect competition, even if they're inefficient, because there's just more room to be wasteful. Because in the perfectly competitive marketplace, everybody's at zero profits. But if in the imperfect competition there's positive profits, so if I'm a little bit inefficient, I can still survive. And I think I'm going to kind of ignore this. We can talk about price discrimination, but I think maybe I'll mention something about that in the next class. Okay. So dealing with natural monopolies, what can public policy do? Public ownership is one approach, has its own challenges, often leads to inefficiencies. Price regulation is a more common one. And there's a place for those price ceilings. Okay. Here's just an unregulated natural monopolist. They're going to charge right here. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. They're going to earn some profit here. They're going to generate some consumer surplus here. Okay. If you regulate the firm, you might try to get it to charge over here. Yeah, I drew the line and screwed up the line there. So here, from a social perspective, you're doing better. You're definitely getting a lot more consumer surplus, even though the firm is, of course, making no money because it's being charged right on its average total cost curve. This is what you're trying to do as a regulator, but it's hard to do. Okay. You can see a lot more consumer surplus here. So it's just something to keep track of. And now we get to oligopoly. Yeah, I don't know why these things are wrong in terms of the why the page numbers are wrong. So here's oligopoly and game theory with some social policy examples, and we'll see how far we go. So remember, I talked about the different structures. Now let's talk about oligopoly and monopolistic competition in a different way. We're going to sort of focus on this part of it for a moment. Okay. So the meaning of oligopoly, why oligopolists have an incentive to act in ways that reduce their combined profits, and why they can benefit from collusion, and how we can use something called game theory, and especially the concept of prisoner's dilemma to understand this. And I said this is useful for many Crown School issues that go beyond economics. Game theory is just just a great thing, although it's complicated. How repeated interactions among oligopolists can help them achieve tacit collusion, and how oligopoly works in practice. Okay. So oligopoly is just quite common. It arises from the same forces that lead to monopoly. It's just a little bit weaker form. So, so there's only a small number of producers, and the producers quickly realize that they have some common interest in keeping prices high. And there's imperfect competition. So, for many years in American auto industry, it was GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Apple and Google might be an oligopoly. There's lots of examples of oligopoly. Big city that has a couple of huge hospitals, same thing going on. To get a better picture of market structure, economists often use something called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI. The HHI for an industry, you just take the square of each firm's market share and then add up over all the firms. So for example, if an industry has 3 firms and their market shares are 60%, 25%, and 15%, then the HHI is just 60 squared plus 25 squared plus 15 squared is 4,450. Right? But for a total monopoly, you have one firm which has 100%, the HHI is 10,000. It's just 100 squared. Now, if you have 100 firms that have 1% market share, then it's just 1% squared, which is 1 times 100. So the HHI in that case is 100. So sort of the extremes go from 10,000 to 100. Kind of interesting. But you might ask yourself, what is Albert Hirschman most known for? He's not most known for the HHI around Crown. He's most known for something else, a wonderful book that he wrote called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, which is one of my favorites. Right? Now, according to Justice Department guidelines, although I must say these are to some extent in the freezer, an HHI below 1,000 indicates a strong competitive industry. Between 1,000 and 1,800 is somewhat competitive, and over 1,800 indicates an oligopoly. There's a concern about it. And so if you're going to have a merger and HHI is over 1,000, the Justice Department is going to take a look at it. Question for you, by the way, suppose that I have 2 firms, each of which has 50% market share. What's the HHI? I'll let you figure that out. Here's the example. What is the HAP has 50%? Sunny has 50%. What's the HHI? What do you think? I'll let you figure that out. And all together now, 5,000. Now, what if there are 3 firms, each of which has a market share of 1/3? I'm going to think about what the Herfindahl index is for that one, or HHI. Here's just another example. Search engine market. If Google has 67% market share, Bing has 18%, and Yahoo has 11%, Ask has 3%, and AOL has 1%. Amazing AOL still exists. You can figure out what the HHI is there. Oops. And just here's some oligopolistic industries. This is old. So this is just something that came out. I think that this is basically from like 15 years ago, but it was sort of interesting to have. PC operating systems, wow, that was big. Remember, monopolist is 10,000. Wide body aircraft, 5,098. This is basically if you had 2 completely equal firms that split the things down the middle, this would be 5,000. So this is basically, wow, this looks a lot like a duopoly. Diamond mining, I was surprised that diamond mining is now lower than it used to be. Automobiles, 1,400, and this is probably lower now. Movies, even more competitive, although now nobody cares. Maybe it's less competitive now because everybody's watching it on Amazon Prime and Netflix. Internet providers, retail grocers, that sort of surprised me. That was really competitive. And again, I don't know how these things change over time. some of the key issues in oligopoly can be understood by looking at the simplest case of duopoly. That's just an oligopoly that has two firms. I will avoid the duop jokes. Now, one of the interesting things about a duopoly is each of the firms would actually do best if they just join forces and act like a monopolist. That's what maximizes the joint profits of everybody. That's hard to do because each firm has an incentive. Each one wants the other one to cut back on its production. If I could just produce a little bit more, I would benefit. So, but they have a clear incentive to collaborate with each other and to do that maybe through a cartel. And we'll talk a little more about ways that can go wrong, but it's really quite striking. So by acting as a single monopolist, oligopolists would actually maximize their combined profit, but then each firm has an incentive to produce a little bit more than it's supposed to under the cartel agreement. And here's the reason why. There's a quantity effect and there's a price effect if I produce a little more. And the monopolist has found the point where the quantity effect and the price effect exactly kind of offset each other at the margin. But if I'm one firm out of two and we're sort of collaborating, if I produce a little bit more, I get 100% of the benefit of the quantity effect. I've sold another unit. I get all the money from that, but I only really bear half the pain that I've driven the price down a little bit, because a lot of that pain is borne by other firms. And if I'm a cartel with lots and lots of firms, you can imagine everybody's a little bit overproducing. If I'm OPEC, Venezuela says, okay, I agreed to produce, X million barrels a day. What if I produce X million plus 10%? Well, the world price of oil is going to drop by some minuscule amount, but I'm a pretty small player and it's only a minuscule change in the price. So I really don't get hurt very much by that tiny decrease in world oil prices, but I get all the benefit of selling a little more oil for myself. And so everybody's kind of producing a little bit more than they've agreed to. And that's, and by that it helps consumers, but it hurts everybody in the cartel. So, there's very often an incentive for each country to hope that every other country underproduces, but to produce a little bit more than they said they would. When they're in a cartel. But again, it's because if I produce a little bit more, I get the entire quantity effect for myself, and the pain and the price effect is spread over everybody in the entire cartel. And so I'm gonna impose on other people a lot of the costs of producing a little more myself in terms of the price effect. Firms can engage in quantity or price competition. Quantity competition is often called Cournot competition. And it turns out to be easier to achieve a reasonable level of collusion with Cournot competition. And price competition very, very often really drives things down to a very low level of profit for the firms. So firms really, really, really want to avoid perfect price competition. Studying oligopoly requires game theory, just a New Yorker cover. When the decision of two or more firms significantly affect each other's profits, we're in a situation of interdependence. And that's where game theory comes into play. And we use these things called payoff matrices to try to get to that. Okay? And matrices are nice ways to see interdependence. So economists use game theory to study firms' behavior. And depending on payoffs, a player or a firm may actually have what's called a dominant strategy. That means no matter what the other firm is doing, here's what I'm doing. That's always best, whatever the other firm is doing. Now, sometimes each firm has a big incentive to cheat, even though if both firms cheat, they end up in a worse situation for each one than if they both cooperated. And that's called the prisoner's dilemma situation. And of course, the prisoner's dilemma, many have seen, imagine I have two 18-year-olds, they both got arrested, and a TV was stolen from Best Buy. And we know, and and the two teenagers, they collaborated to steal the TV. They would both benefit if they would just keep their mouths shut and not say anything to the police. What the police do is they put each of the two teenagers in a separate room, and the detective comes into, one room and says, Veronica, we got Harold in the other room, and he's gonna, I don't have a whole lot of time on this. I got to resolve this case, this stolen TV. It's pretty obvious that you guys did it. Whoever helps me first, put in a good word for them. And if you just clam up, it's your right to do it. You can call a lawyer, whatever. I can tell you that we're going to convict you anyway. And if you don't help me, your counterpart's going to confess anyway, and they'll get the benefit of cooperation, and we'll give you a stiffer sentence because you're wasting our time. And of course, they're saying exactly the same thing to each of the teenagers. And it's quite possible. Now, both of those teenagers might be better off if each one just kind of shut up. But of course, there's a very high probability that they'll both end up turning each other in, and then they each, then they both get convicted. So, prisoner's dilemma situations where my individual incentive is very, very different from our collective incentive to act together. And so the prisoner's dilemma, what we'd really like to do is coordinate it, have each of us be quiet and not say anything that helps us be convicted, but each of us privately has an incentive to confess first, so that the other one bears the consequences of the crime. But one of the reasons why organized crime is sometimes effective is you can change the incentives there. So if we were stealing that TV and then giving it to our mafia intermediary who's going to sell it, you could imagine that the mafia might say, if you provide information that helps the police convict your colleague, something bad's going to happen to you. And you can imagine that could be an effective way to create a different equilibrium. I had my office mate when I was in graduate school was a political prisoner in South Korea, and he was telling me that he was in with people from the pickpockets union. And while there was a thriving pickpocketing industry, and when people were arrested for pickpocketing, the pickpockets union would help support their families as long as they didn't, provide information to the authorities that would be bad for business. And so people never cooperated with the police, and it was kind of a part of cost of doing business. They would occasionally get arrested and spend some time in jail. And now, a few things about game theory. I realize this is getting a little late at night, and this is dense stuff, but it's interesting. There's two main flavors of game theory: cooperative and non-cooperative game theory. And within non-cooperative game theory, there's an important distinction: zero-sum or constant-sum games, where my loss is automatically your gain and vice versa. The Jets versus the Dolphins. If I get more points, you're getting less. Although we both have an incentive not to see players hurt or whatever. And then there's other kinds of games where we have distinctive but overlapping interests that are really not zero-sum. So there's most real life situations. The United States is competing with China economically. Boy, we have a lot of common interests too. It's not a zero-sum thing. And Coke and Pepsi have common interests. Southwest and United Airlines have common interests. The US and the Taliban have common interests. Coordination can be very difficult, and multiple outcomes are possible. There's this sort of equilibrium where we're really fighting each other a lot, and there's an equilibrium where we're cooperating more, and both of those are possible. It's interesting, like Southwest and United. What are some common interests there? First of all, they want to keep prices high, but secondly, they want to do things that make people think flying is kind of a cool thing to do. You don't want United, you don't see United running lots of ads. That Southwest had a terrible plane crash 10 years ago, and lots of people died. That would be an extremely problematic thing. if airlines did that, because of course you don't want people thinking, oh, every time I fly, there's a risk that I could die. That's not good for business. So you don't see negative ads where, United might say Southwest's food isn't as good as United or something like that, but they typically don't, you don't see ads that sort of play on people's safety anxieties, because that's bad for the entire industry. Now, game theory, what does it require us to understand? We want to understand the preferences of the players, that is, their payoffs as they perceive them, how decisions are made, the sequence of decisions, and also the information that's available to everybody, because we're all making decisions based on what we know. And who gets to move first matters. Sometimes it's an advantage to move first, sometimes it's a disadvantage. And what are people trying to achieve? And what I love about this is that this is true for understanding so many situations in life that we don't think of in a straight up way as being economic. And I've mentioned a bunch in class. The greatest game theorist that I've ever read is Erving Goffman, the sociologist, and just how he can talk about these everyday situations, the presentation of self in everyday life, and draw really valuable game theoretic insights. So here, one of the key concepts in game theory is something called Nash equilibrium. A Beautiful Mind is about John Nash. I was working in the student library as an undergraduate, and John Nash used to come in. He was a very wistful character. And the idea behind Nash equilibrium is you and I are competing, or at least we're in a competitive situation, and I'm following the best strategy for me, given what I anticipate that you'll do, and you're following the best strategy for yourself, given what you anticipate that I will do, and those two things are kind of mutually consistent. That my strategy makes sense, given what I think you're going to do, and the thing that I think you're going to do is what you will do, trying to predict what I'm going to do. And that situation is called a Nash equilibrium. So Ford picks the right level of production given what it thinks GM and Chrysler are doing, and GM and Chrysler are doing exactly the same thing, and they end up being kind of mutually consistent with each other. Now, let me give you some goofy examples, some of which have been cleaned up a bit from the movie A Beautiful Mind. So I tell you that you got to pair up in writing up your problem sets, and you and two of your friends, the 4 possible people to pair with. Okay? Sydney's definitely the smartest. You'll do the best in the course if you try to work with her, but if you approach her and she rejects you, then you're going to be stuck, because you're going to go to Curtis as your second favorite, and Curtis might then reject you because he doesn't want to be your economics 454 safety date. He's going to be insulted that you went to Sydney first. So you and your friends are all looking, trying to figure out who's going to go as Sydney first, whatever. And the equilibrium can be no one approaches Sydney, and she ends up doing the problem set alone because people think that she's going to reject them. Now, this wouldn't be an equilibrium if one of you were clearly a much more appealing homework partner than the others. Then that person could approach Sydney, and Sydney would be very likely to say yes. So there's some goofy things where sometimes the Nash equilibrium ends up being not quite what you expect, and doesn't match, particularly the preferences of any one player. Nobody really wanted to see Sydney working alone, but they just thought that they didn't want to risk her rejecting them. Here's a payoff matrix. Here's an agricultural example where Ajinomoto and ADM are competing with each other, and each one can produce its output levels, and they're trying to pick the level that maximizes their profit. So Ajinomoto is picking which column should I be in, given what I think ADM is going to do, and ADM is saying which row should I be in, given what I think Ajinomoto is going to do. So if Ajinomoto says I'm going to produce 30 million pounds, then ADM says, oh, if they're going to do 30 million pounds, I'm going to produce 40 because my profit, if I produce 40 and they produce 30, I'll get 190 million. If I choose to produce 30 while they're producing 30, I'm only going to get 180. This 190 is better than 180, so I'm going to be down here. Okay? Now, interestingly enough, if Ajinomoto says, "Oh, I think that ADM is going to produce 40 million pounds," I know that ADM is going to be somewhere down here. Which column should I pick? Ajinomoto says, "Oh, I should pick this column here, because if I choose to produce 30, I'll make 160 million, and if I choose to produce 40, I'll only make 150." And so this column is optimal if they think, when Ajinomoto thinks that ADM is going to be down in this bottom row. And for ADM, this bottom row is optimal when it thinks that Ajinomoto is going to be in this first column. So this thing here emerges as a Nash equilibrium. It kind of, there's a consistency in what they're doing. That's pretty impressive. They're, by the way, note that they did not end up at the situation that would give them the most profits altogether, did they? Because suppose instead of ending up here, they ended up here. The total profits here is 360 million. The total profits here are only 350. So the Nash equilibrium isn't necessarily the best joint outcome, but it's the one that is the most mutually reinforcing. That, so, if ADM says, "Oh, I think Ajinomoto is going to be in this column," then it says, "Oh, this row is the best row for me as ADM." And similarly, Ajinomoto says, "Oh, if ADM is in this bottom row, I want to be in this first column." And so this thing here ends up being a really nice equilibrium that has that Nash property to it. Okay. Question for you. You and your college best friend unexpectedly discover that you're both going to be in Manhattan tomorrow, and you talk by cell phone. Your friend says, "Let's meet at," and her phone goes dead before she can say where. And you just can't talk to her before the weekend. What will you do in this coordination game? How would you deal with that? So there's where you're trying to coordinate with each other. Second example, you're on the Amtrak platform and you meet a fellow student that you want to avoid if at all possible because of reasons. So you suggest meeting in the dining car, and you want some plausible deniability about avoiding her. To your relief, you find out that there's a first-class diner and a coach diner. So you can go to one innocently, thereby kind of missing her sort of by accident, but not. What would you do in this anti-coordination game? And think about how you would handle this situation. I think I'd probably flip a coin. And there's a lot of general stuff that we see in a lot of other kinds of games here. So your best response is what yields the highest payoff for you given the other player's choice, but then you've got to put yourself in the other person's shoes and say, does that make sense that they would act that way if they've thought about how I'm going to respond? Okay? Here's the prisoner's dilemma. Thelma and Louise. Thelma's in one room, Louise is in another, police detectives trying to get each one to confess and think out on the other. So notice, if I'm Thelma, I don't confess, or I can confess. Okay? If I confess, it's always better for me. So, for instance, if Louise does not confess, if I confess, I get a 2-year sentence if I'm Thelma. If I don't confess, I get a 5-year sentence. So 2 years is better. If Louise confessed, that's bad for me. But if I confess also, I'll get a 15-year sentence. If I don't confess, I'll get a 20-year sentence. And everything is completely symmetrical, so Louise has exactly the same problem. Now, of course, what's very likely to happen is what? You're going to end up, the Nash equilibrium is down here. They each get a 15-year sentence, when they would each have been better off in this don't confess mode. But this one is really hard. What I really want to do if I'm Thelma is I want Louise not to confess. I'm sorry, I want to confess myself. But of course, the other person has exactly the same incentive. So it's very, very, this one here is not a very sustainable situation. at least if it's a one-shot game. You know, if we're just going to play this once, there's a big incentive for each player to betray the other. And that's the idea behind the prisoner's dilemma. That you'd both be better off if you could stay up in this box. But if you think you're going to be in this box, you have a big incentive to confess anyway and have the other person bear the weight of it. And the weird thing is, for each person, by the way, I should say that confessing is a dominant strategy. No matter what Louise does, Thelma's always better off confessing. 2 is better than 5 here. 15 is better than 20 here. Confessing is always a dominant strategy, but if each one follows their own individual dominant strategy, they end up in a bad place. They end up down here when they would have been much better off ending up here. So that's the prisoner's dilemma aspect. Okay? So each player's dominant strategy produces a poor collective outcome. And so that's the story of the Nash equilibrium. Okay? So in this particular case, here's a prisoner's dilemma type situation when you have 2 firms in a competing as a duopoly. So each firm can produce 30 or can produce 40. So the 2 firms together would do best if each one produced 30, because what that's doing is it's creating a shortage, keeping a pretty high market price. But suppose I'm ADM and I know that Ajinomoto has chosen to produce 30. Well, I've got an incentive to produce 40 instead of 30 because I get the entire quantity effect and I only bear half the cost of the price effect. So for ADM, they say, oh, I'm going to end up, I want to be down here. But of course, these 2 firms are in exactly a symmetrical situation. So Ajinomoto says, oh, if I know whatever I know you're going to do, you ADM, I'm going to choose 40 because if I produce 40 million barrels, suppose that I know that you're down here. If I produce 40 million, I'll get 100 million profit. If I produce 30 million, I will get 90 million profit. So it's a dominant strategy for Ajinomoto to produce in this column, and it's a dominant strategy for ADM to produce in this column. And you end up down here, total profits of 200 million. If you could have stayed up here, they would have had higher profits, 220 million. But this situation was not sustainable. It's not a Nash equilibrium. This one is. If I'm ADM and I know that Ajinomoto is in this first column here, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to want to be down here. But then if Ajinomoto knows that ADM is down at this bottom thing, then what Ajinomoto says is, oh, I want to be then in, produce 40 million over here. Okay? So the best collective outcome is sort of not sustainable. Okay? Here's a real world prisoner's dilemma. Maybe we should just all stop advertising. You could see how advertising doesn't lead people to drink more cola overall, but it might lead people to drink your cola rather than your competitor's cola. This is what I'm drinking. So advertising is a kind of prisoner's dilemma sometime where both firms end up advertising more than they really want to. Okay? So here's an example where Pepsi and Coke spend a lot of money advertising, and they end up at this Nash equilibrium down here, which is less profitable than the no advertising equilibrium up here. Not clear this is bad from the point of view of the consumer, but it's bad from the point of view of these 2 firms. Why the failure to cooperate? Well, they might expect the other to defect, or just each one is making the best choice they can given the choice the other makes. And it's just hard for these firms to cooperate in that kind of situation. There's just too much of an incentive to to do more advertising, even though that's not helping them collectively. Now, if they're part of a long run relationship, that might actually, you can get more cooperation that way. And I'll give, so one of the ways that you can induce cooperation, which can be good or bad, it's bad if it's helping a cartel maintain higher prices. It's good if it's producing some other social values. If people are part of a long run relationship, then it's easier to do things that in the short run might seem costly to any one party. So so in a way, it's a good thing that companies have a hard time colluding. That often leads to more consumer surplus. So if firms find ways to get around their prisoner's dilemma problem, that's often bad for consumers. And public policies might actually be required to hinder their ability to cooperate to lower output. Right, here's prisoner's dilemma in real life. Sheriff in Franklin County, Kentucky, put up a flyer on Facebook that just asked local drug dealers to snitch on their competitors. And it's always been the case that in the drug space that a lot of the best intelligence comes from competitors. They have a clear incentive to reduce the competition and also to get in good graces with the police. This is sort of beauty wars thing. I'm a bad person to comment on anything like that, but you can imagine we all spend too much money on our sartorial splendor, too much time, because everyone else is spending a lot of time on their appearance. I can't say that I'm an example of anything in the beauty wars. Warren Buffett had a sort of interesting idea that he proposed a campaign finance bill, and he said he would donate $1 billion to whichever side delivered the most votes for the bill if it doesn't pass. And the idea is Democrats don't want Republicans to get that $1 billion, so they all vote for it. Republicans have exactly the same logic. They all vote for it, and then it passes, and Buffett doesn't have to pay anything because he said, if it doesn't pass, I'll donate $1 billion. By the way, not clear this is the best way for any public policy to operate, but it's sort of an intriguing idea. So I mentioned, competition between firms has that prisoner's dilemma aspect. Product differentiation provides one way out of that dilemma by reducing cross-price elasticities. Collective action problems have a certain prisoner's dilemma aspect. So, think about people that are fishing off of the coast of Cape Cod. Everybody wants to maintain that stock of fish, but each one individually wants to catch as much fish as possible. I don't want the earth to burn up, but I don't want my country to make unilateral sacrifices while India or China or the US or Europe or whoever reap undeserved benefits. I'm a liberal Crown professor. I send my kid to the lab school rather than Chicago public schools because all of my peers are doing the same thing or moving to fancy suburbs. I'm a Woodlawn homeowner in 1966. I prefer an integrated community, but I don't want to be the last middle-class homeowner with diminishing home equity who hasn't fled. You can see these kinds of collective action problems, at least as described by their participants, can be important. I don't want to be the only witness who speaks out against local drug sellers in my community. I'm a moderate Republican candidate in 2016. I really disdain Donald Trump and would like all the other moderates to drop out so that we can all unite around one moderate who can defeat Trump. But I'm waiting for everybody else to do that. And these collective action problems they're really, they're very pervasive. Okay? So how do we overcome the prisoner's dilemma? One is through repeated interactions and tacit collusion. So if a game is, if you can gain a reputation, you can take some short-term sacrifice, and it's worth it for you, because in the long run you get benefit from it. Yeah? So tit for tat is the most famous example. I've always cooperated with people unless they don't cooperate with me, and then I punish them the next time we play. And if I have a reputation for doing that, that can lead to successful tacit collusion. So I'm always cooperating until someone, takes advantage of that. And then the next time I play them, I punish them for that. So when firms limit production and raise prices in a way that raises each other's profits, even though they haven't made any formal arrangement, they're doing tacit collusion. Okay? By example of tacit collusion, where I'm a gas station, and there's another gas station right across the street from me, and we each post pretty high prices. We never talk to each other about it, but we all read each other's signs, and we realize, it'd be stupid of me to start lowering my price and trying to undercut my neighboring gas station, because they're going to do the same thing to me, and we'll both end up splitting the market and and getting lower prices for the gas that we sell. So there's opportunities for tacit collusion by signaling, by publicly posting our prices, things like that. If we interact repeatedly, I can gain a reputation as a cooperator and maybe as someone who punishes non-cooperators. This may or may not be good from a social perspective. But one of the most interesting historical examples were the Christmas truces and other devices whereby soldiers in opposing trenches stopped shooting at each other. So the German and the French soldiers in the First World War, the German and the English soldiers, there was this killing field across the entire length of Europe that was maybe a couple hundred yards wide in places, where when soldiers got on and tried to attack the other side, or there would be massive losses, or when snipers, when someone would try to go to the bathroom and go to the outhouse, if a sniper killed that person, that was horrible. And the two sides kind of worked out these de facto truces where we didn't shoot at people. Our snipers didn't shoot at people going to the bathroom and the outhouses, or we would let the other side evacuate their wounded when an attack was repulsed. And in 1916-17, there were some really interesting examples where basically the two sides kind of stopped fighting each other. And the generals on each side were very upset about that. And they would do things to try to disrupt those equilibria. Like they would rotate troops around so that there was not it was not the same group of French and the same group of Germans facing each other for months on end. They would rotate them around, or they would do things like bring in outside raiding parties. And so if you're the French army, you'd say, we're going to bring in this French unit from another place, and they are going to attack the Germans across the line and disrupt this sort of cozy non-aggression pact that the two sides had found. And I highly recommend Robert Axelrod's Evolution of Cooperation to tell these stories. It's really quite interesting. The rise and fall of OPEC. OPEC is a cartel that had some prisoner's dilemma-like issues. And how successful was the cartel? It was pretty successful, but it varied how successful. Here's just a map of sort of prices that they had over time. This goes up to 2007. I've got a better one that goes a little bit more recent. But you can see that they're trying to keep the price of oil high, and they really were all over the map. Prices skyrocketed when there was a war, but often when there wasn't a war, OPEC had a hard time keeping the price up. Oligopolies operate under legal restrictions from antitrust policies that try to limit the tacit collusion and the overt collusion. Tacit collusion there's a couple things that make it hard. One is if there's a lot of firms, Each firm has more of an incentive to cheat if it's just a tiny player like that one small country in OPEC. If there's a really complex product with complex pricing, they're sort of more, it's easier to cheat. If buyers have a lot of bargaining power, or if they're just the firms have different interests, then tacit collusion can be quite hard. And when collusion breaks down, you can have a price war. As I've mentioned, price differentiation can be helpful for cartels to avoid that. All of these different ways that they can differentiate. Sometimes you have one dominant firm that exercises what's called price leadership, and everybody kind of looks to that firm to see what prices are used. Oligopolists often prefer to have non-price competition over price competition. So you have two airlines, they're flying to France from Chicago. They don't want to compete directly on price. They would rather find something else they can compete on, like maybe the quality of the food. Or one of them offers excellent food and the other one offers really excellent internet service, something like that, but where they're avoiding driving their prices down to zero. So, so the non-price competition can be quite important. Price leadership is basically where a dominant firm sets prices and the other firms follow. So nothing interesting to say about these slides. Here's the party problem, sort of a coordination game. You'd rather go to the same party as your friends. They would rather go to the same party as you. And you're sort of trying to figure out how to do this. I say that I do not go to parties, so I'm a bad person to ask this question of. But this is a coordination game. You have to somehow coordinate this. Another coordination game is kind of technology adoption. Nothing too interesting with this, but you're trying to figure out you're trying to come up with some common standard. You can see that there's multiple equilibria. Which will your friends buy? How will you successfully coordinate? That's a challenge. Threats, promises, and credibility. Sometimes credible threats can get you a lot of stuff. So, North Korea can sometimes extract concessions because they're just assumed to be more reckless and unpredictable. And if they say, we could fire a nuclear missile, we're like, no, don't do that. We will make a concession because we don't want that to happen. That's a credible threat. Pre-commitment. 7-Eleven has a time lock, so these signs that say clerk cannot open safe. That's protecting the clerk because it's basically saying the clerk cannot get, if you come in with a gun and try to rob that clerk, they cannot get you money because they can't get into the safe. U of M, by the way, University of Michigan, publishes all faculty salaries. Chicago doesn't. It's sort of interesting how this changes wage negotiations at each school, because there's a sense at University of Michigan where they can pre-commit not to raise certain faculty salaries. So suppose that I go to the dean at University of Michigan, I say, I need to get another $15,000. I've got a competing offer. And the dean could say, well, Harold, you're worth it. The problem is if I give you that $15,000 raise, it's going to be public. And then I've got 4 other faculty who are your peers, and they're all going to be in my office wanting that same raise. And so I'm sorry, dude, I can't do that. I can't raise your salary $15,000 because that public nature of it makes it really expensive for me because of the other people who are your same quality. At Chicago, it's a lot easier for them to say, oh, here's the $15,000, we won't tell anybody. And that, in some ways, that works to Chicago's disadvantage because it makes it easier for them to make a concession to an individual faculty member. And U of M can pre-commit not to do that because they say it's just too expensive for us to do that. Making threats credible is kind of interesting. So suppose I'm buying a house, I'm willing to buy anything under $300,000, and the seller's willing to sell for anything over $250,000. How much will the house sell for? Maybe, I don't know, maybe halfway, something like that. 275 maybe. Well, if I make a contract with a third party, I agree in writing that I'll pay her $50,000 if I pay any price over $255,000 for that house. Now, how much will that house sell for? Well, probably something like $255,000 if there's no other buyers around. Because I can credibly say to the seller, I just can't pay more than 255 for that house because I also have to pay this other person 50,000. Okay, so this is sort of an interesting thing. It's a way that I'm tying my own hands and saying I can only buy at a really low price. Isn't that kind of clever? Tom Schelling wrote about that. A really smart guy. My large furniture store runs TV ads that say I will not be undersold. I will match any published sale price from my competitors. And ironically, my prices might stay pretty high because basically my competitors are like, well, if I lower my prices, that's not going to help me because the large furniture store is just going to match my prices. But then, of course, if Walmart moves to town, then I might be in trouble because I can be undersold. Walmart can just say, okay, we're going to charge what we're going to charge. And if you want to match our prices, eventually you're just going to go out of business. So this is sort of an interesting one that works unless you have a gigantic competitor. Okay. Equilibrium may not match any individual's preferences. I will read to you on some other occasion Václav Havel's amazing essay, The Power of the Powerless, where he talks about the Czech greengrocer who hangs a Workers of the World Unite sign in his shop window. This was under communism, in the late 1970s. And Havel says the grocer hangs the sign not because he believes in or even notices the sign, but because he just wants to be left alone. And everybody else is doing the same thing. And they're all basically deferring to an authoritarian government who had a slogan, Workers of the World Unite. I would say more in my generation than in your generation. There was a tremendous amount of homophobia and expressed transphobia, especially among young cisgender men, and also actions against people with disabilities. And it was social conformity as the Nash equilibrium. Many people were privately quite appalled by the homophobic and transphobic environment, but did not want to be the first person to speak out against it. And so a lot of people were very quiet. There's multiple equilibria in that, of course, because if lots of people speak out, then it becomes easier to speak out. And some of what people object to in political correctness is it's not cool, to express these views. And I sort of say, yeah, it's a much better equilibrium than when I was a teenager or when I was 25, when the equilibrium was very often to let stand, public denigration of our, of fellow citizens. Community organizers, of course, know that very well, and racial tipping is a very difficult example. Suppose most whites are willing to live in integrated communities. Let's suppose we have a society that has white people and black people, just to oversimplify. A neighborhood might start out with 100 white people, and then 3 non-whites move in, and 92 whites are perfectly happy with that mix, but 5 are uncomfortable with it. Either they're fearful or they're racist, and they leave, and then they're replaced by non-whites, and you can see the whole thing could actually kind of unravel. Even if most whites favor integration, there may be no stable equilibrium that doesn't lead to racial tipping in that community. Now, sometimes you can prevent things like racial tipping through pre-commitment. Say some important institution can't move. And Gerald Gamm did studies of white flight in cities like Chicago and Boston, and compared Jewish neighborhoods, Italian neighborhoods, Italian and Italian. I don't know why this is so messed up, apologies. And found that the Jewish neighborhoods were attitudinally much more welcoming of their non-white minorities moving in, but tipped much faster. And that was true in Woodlawn, North Lawndale, Roxbury, the South Bronx. And many of these places actually tipped within a couple of years in the 1960s. And there were a bunch of reasons for that. one reason that Gamm points out, which he probably overstated, but had some truth to it, was that Catholic churches really didn't move, even when the neighborhoods were changing. So businesses and homes located near the churches knew that the churches would remain there. And that provided a certain source of stability. Synagogues tended to move when their congregants did. So these synagogues did not provide a kind of anchoring institution that the churches did. Now, I think that's a little bit overstated because some members of my family are Orthodox and actually do walk to synagogue, and those places have stayed in the same place for a long time. But there's some truth to that. University of Chicago, of course, plays a role like that in Hyde Park, and but there's interesting literature on tipping that comes from this. Pardon me for some of the typos in this. I can't believe that I let that typo go. Political correctness is an interesting signaling game. One of my favorite expressions in politics is, it's not what you say about your issues, it's what your issues say about you. If you think about that, that's actually a really interesting statement. And there's good and bad about it. And people, we draw inferences about other people based on the issues that they emphasize. And suppose I walked into a Crown classroom and I just blurted out some of these sentences. Some people with honestly kind of marginal health challenges take up disability benefits because they really don't want to take a low-wage job at McDonald's. Or say Zionism is racism, or say anti-Zionism is racism, or they say I'm uncomfortable seeing a 6'2" trans woman win a college swim meet against cisgender women. Affirmative action sometimes induces discrimination against Asian American applicants. Hunter Biden's laptop sure has some weird stuff on it. Each of these sentences that I could speak, there's a question, what do I think about the truth value of that sentence? But there's also the question of, why am I saying that? Why am I choosing to say that, knowing that I'm in a room of people who are going to interpret my own values in light of what I just said? If I walked in a room, I said Zionism is racism, you're going to make some inferences about me. You might make different inferences, by the way, depending on my own positionality. But the idea that you could sort of take each of these comments on its own, that's just not the way human interaction works. You're going to, if I make a statement, suppose that I make a statement where, most people who say Zionism is racism aren't really, not really super positive about Jewish people. And they're also willing to have people believe that they're not super positive about Jewish people. And yet this person chose to say this. So that must be that he's kind of in that group. Or somebody who says anti-Zionism is racism, you can say the comparable inference that this is I think many of these sentences we would say, boy, I'm drawing some inferences about the person saying those things, and not always the most positive inference. And so some of these things, even if I believed it, I probably wouldn't say it, or I wouldn't say it in quite the same way. Yeah? I mean, now what's interesting is, so Harold Pollack, person who was in the Biden campaign, could probably say, Hunter Biden's laptop sure has some weird stuff on it. You're probably not inferring stuff about me the way you would a total stranger, or you might say, the only time I've ever heard anybody talk about Hunter Biden's laptop is watching Fox TV or something. Yeah? And so political correctness is sort of an interesting strategic interaction that we have. You can't directly view my values, but you can see what I choose to say, knowing that you're trying to guess my values. And that if I still choose to say something, you're going to draw conclusions about me. Okay? So more examples. Christian conservatives sometimes appeal to religious freedom to rationalize or legally defend policies intended to stigmatize or discriminate against LGBTQ plus fellow citizens. Secular liberals increasingly dominate American culture, often disrespect religious conservatives, and too easily dismiss legitimate arguments for religious pluralism as covert expressions of bigotry. Candidate Donald Trump has made many racist and xenophobic statements. These helped him with the 2016 Republican primary because they expressed the views of many Republican primary voters. Or if we're talking about HIV/AIDS, most known AIDS patients used injection drugs or were gay men who had unprotected sex with many partners. If you said exactly that same sentence, but then you added, and of course there was that poor Ryan White kid and other hemophilia patients. Think about all the different ways we would interpret the values of people making these statements. And so in some factual way, you could say all of these statements, have some factual basis. I mean, there's some that are appalling here, like this. Clearly, when you look at this bottom one, you say, wow, that's they're clearly saying, making a judgment that poor Ryan White kid is different from these other people. That's the most obvious way where you would say, wow, a person who would say that sentence, you really learn some about their values. But you could see a bunch of these things up above here. You could say, I actually think there's truth value in all of these statements, but wow, the people saying them there's a Venn diagram of people saying those things that doesn't have a whole lot of overlap in there. And we're learning a lot about somebody's values. And there's certain groups of people where you would make some of these statements, and there's certain groups of people where you'd say, I kind of hesitate to say that. They're I could add more examples. 1995, OJ was obviously guilty. This one I'm now dating myself because all you weren't even born in 1995. 2022, Chicago would have a lower murder rate if more residents of hard-hit South and West Side communities came forward to assist police investigations. Chicago would have a lower murder rate if CPD officers conducted themselves in a more respectful way in hard-hit South and West Side communities, and if CPD more effectively addressed racism and misconduct within the law enforcement community. These are three correct statements. And you would draw very different conclusions about the person making them, even though they're factually, each one of these statements has a tremendous factual basis, but you're drawing completely different conclusions about the values of the person who's making those statements. It's kind of an interesting thing. It's just a lot going on under the surface in human conversation. Human conversation is always a multi-level thing. And I'm sort of, you'll read something by Glenn Lowry about this, which I think is just pretty interesting. I want members of my community to think highly of me and to know that I share their values. And I know that people have a reasonable reason to doubt maybe my true commitment to those values, and they're going to judge my commitment based on what I say and don't say. And that's going to constrain what I say. And the Nash equilibrium may be certain topics we just don't talk about. And because I care so much about being accepted in my community, I wouldn't want to say anything that would call my commitment into doubt, or that would give ammunition to those who wish us ill. Very often, one of my most concerning moments when I watch a job talk at Crown is when someone presents an empirical finding from their dissertation, and someone in the audience says, well, aren't you giving ammunition to people who don't think, who do not wish well the populations that we care about? Because, boy, that is the kind of, that is something that often in a pragmatic way, I understand why people are worried about that, but it's also an invitation to self-censorship in a way that makes it difficult to have a fully open conversation about some of the things that we need to be talking about. I remember in my own childhood, many of the people who spoke up first about human rights abuses that were going on perpetrated against Palestinians under occupation after the 1967 war in the Six-Day War in between Israel and its neighbors. many of the first people talking about the human rights issues that involved Palestinians were people who did not particularly wish Israel well or wish Jews well. And so a lot of people that I knew did not want to talk about that issue. And one of the consequences of that is that people were not speaking about obvious injustices that were occurring that needed to be addressed and needed to be openly acknowledged. And there was a degree of self-censorship on that was quite harmful and unjust. Now, I should say, obviously, there's many sides to every issue, and there are certainly issues that the people that were sympathetic to the Palestinians may not have had their own self-censorship about certain things that were happening perpetrated against Israelis. But I remember very well how long it took for people to just recognize some of the obvious realities. And there was a kind of political correctness going on that you just did not want to be seen as someone who was hostile to Israel. I think now, ironically, now it's sometimes the opposite, where where because of the injustices occurring against the Palestinians, sometimes people will not say the fairly obvious things that are going on that are sort of pointing in the other direction. But these are just really concerning dynamics, but they come out of a very understandable internal dynamic in every community. And the more I care about being part of my community, the more I'm worried about how the things I will say will be taken. And this expression, read the room, that's read the room is kind of a way of saying, that thing you're thinking of saying, maybe it's not the world's greatest idea to say it. And sometimes it's not the world's greatest idea, but sometimes it's something that people need to say. And so I find myself thinking about these issues. And so that's that sort of political correctness emerging as a Nash equilibrium in a way that sometimes actually positive for promoting social values, but sometimes not. And it's one reason why it's really important that you have a community that has a real diversity of perspectives, because sometimes that's the only way that certain views are going to be aired. And I have a standard talk where I note John Stuart Mill saying, if you only know your side of the argument, you really don't know that. And it's a real issue. So and so anyway, that's sort of an interesting aspect. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for bearing with me. It's incredibly late at night, and but at least that's an aspect of my lecture, and to be continued.